Boop. Happy Tuesday. Today is Tuesday, March the 9th, 2021. Today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 84, 2 Chronicles 29, 1 through 11, and then 16 through 19, and Hebrews 9, 23 through 28. And I'm going to take a look at the section from 2 Chronicles today and talk about what happens when we abandon worship. Really abandon worship. I mean, we've all tried to make the best out of a bad situation over this past year. And so, in this day of internet connectivity and social media, really has been very, very useful. But what happens when we just totally abandon worship? So when Hezekiah began to rule Judah, he finds a temple, right? He takes over, I think the text says he was 25 years old, right? So he's a young 20-something. And he takes over worship of the kingdom of Judah. And he finds a temple that just had been abandoned by the very priests whose job it was to keep the worship of God going. So Hezekiah tells us that the Levites had turned their faces. And actually, he's saying this to the priests. He's calling them out on it. He gathers them all together and he says, this is what's happened. But they've turned their faces away from God and they've turned their backs on him. And they literally just turned the lights off and shut the door and never came back to the temple. I'm sure they had their reasons. And I'm sure they all sounded really good to them at the time, but Hezekiah puts a name on it and he just calls it unfaithful. And it was because it was their duty, it was their covenant, and it was their calling. Remember, the tribe of Levi had been called and set aside by God. I think if you go back and look at Numbers, yeah. You see where God kind of reminds the people of Israel, he says, look, I spared your firstborn when you came out of Egypt, and so they technically belong to me, but I'm going to make you a deal. I'll take the tribe of Levi for my own. And that was their calling. They were the ones who were set apart from Israel to dedicate themselves to the praise and the worship of God on a daily basis. But they just walked away, and the last person out just blew out the lights and closed the door. So anyway, Hezekiah takes over as the king, and he opens the door one day. He fixes the door, first of all, and he sets his eyes on the temple, and he opens the doors and finds this mess where there should be praise and worship, where there should be fresh bread and incense and lights. It's just darkness and dirt and filth. And he knew that he couldn't rule a country whose beating heart was just so dead and so filthy. Hezekiah knew that he couldn't expect the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob to bless the king's own household when the people had neglected God's house. And so it was time to reopen the temple. It was time to reopen. But first, and this is where the rest of the passage goes today, you should read it. But first it was time for some spring cleaning. It was time for spring cleaning in the hearts of the priests and in the heart of the temple itself. The DBR on Friday was Peter telling us how we're all living stones built on the foundation of Christ, and that we are, we're basically the church is the new priest on earth. We fulfill that role, not the same way that Christ does. If you want to understand how Christ is the priest, go read the Hebrews text for today, 9:23 through 28. But we're the ones that are supposed to be perpetually worshiping and praising God. And sometimes we're kind of like the priests. We just abandon worship for whatever reasons sound good to us at the time. But we're just kind of turn off the lights and the last one out closes the door. So it's probably time for spring cleaning. Anyway, have a good day. We'll be back tomorrow with another DBR. Get out, enjoy the good weather. We'll see you later. Boop.